who better than to discuss how inequality affects mental health than Dr. Lade Smith. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome her to the stage.
Okay, so good evening everyone sitting in the room and good evening to those at home. So I'm going to talk about inequality because inequality is bad for mental health. And the big question is this. Well, first and foremost, you all, I hope, know that mental health problems are actually quite common. So just to be clear, we all have mental health. Some people develop mental illness. And in fact, it's about 1 in 4 people in their lifetime will develop a clinically significant mental health problem. And for the most part, people have a prevailing view that that's because of some kind of inherent problem that that person has, a constitutional problem, something to do with their genetics, something to do with their biological makeup. But I am going to argue tonight that it's not as simple as that, actually, because some people are much more likely to develop mental health problems than others. And of course, the question is, why? So, first and foremost, who is most at risk of developing mental health problems? Well, we know that if you happen to be a woman, you will be more likely to develop a mental health problem during your lifetime than if you are a man. And of course, that's because of our hormones. Oh, good. I'm quite glad that a few people in the room at least went, it's not as simple as that. But that's what traditionally we were told. For some reason, female hormones make women's moods odd. Male hormones somehow don't seem to affect them. I don't think that's the case. But we know that women are more likely to develop mental health problems, or certainly report and present with their mental health problems. We know that people who have learning disability and autism are much more likely to develop a comorbid, that means a co-occurring psychiatric illness, and that ranges from anxiety all the way up to more severe mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar illness. We know that if you are homeless, being homeless is very much associated with developing a mental illness. And actually, having a mental illness increases the likelihood of you becoming homeless, unfortunately. We also know that if you are poorer, it's a problem. But one of the big things that's apparent and that's been a problem for many, many years now is that if you are black or from any other minoritized ethnic background, you are at much higher risk of developing and being diagnosed with a mental health problem than if you are from a white majority population. And that's the case in Britain, in the USA, in Australia, in the Netherlands. And it's not simply about being black, in fact, this slide shows that anyone from any minoritized ethnic group, and this is a particularly racialized group, and it actually includes white groups who aren't a majority white British. So, for example, people from Gypsy, Roma, traveller backgrounds, and people who are white Eastern European, particularly recent migrants, are much more likely to be detained under a section of the Mental Health Act. That means that you might be detained compulsorily against your will because it's thought you have such a severe mental health problem that you may well not be able to keep yourself safe or be safe around other people. Okay? And it's to help you get better from your illness. And in fact, it's what that red ring shows is how very significant it is, actually, every single minoritized ethnic group. And it's particularly bad for black people, who are up to 3 times more likely to be detained under section than the white British majority population. And if you happen to be a man from a black Caribbean background, then you are much more likely to be detained under section again and again and again. And that's just been a fact, and it has been the case for the last 40-odd years. Question is, of course, why? Well, we do know that about 40% of black people who end up coming to mental health services actually come in crisis. And that means, because normally if you're not very well, you go to your GP, and you say, I don't feel so good, And if it's your mood, if it's mood, you say, I don't feel so good, the GP, will try and treat you, and if they can't, they'll send you to specialist services. Okay, that's the way you get into mental health services usually, just like you do if you've got a renal problem or a chest problem, etc. But for some reason, 40% of black people are actually access services in crisis with the help of the police or through the criminal justice system. They come in crisis in A&E, or they're picked up in the street because people think there's something wrong with this guy. And interestingly, although you're more likely to be picked up in crisis, it's far less likely that if you are black or Asian or any other minoritized ethnic group, that you will be offered outpatient psychological treatment. So there's massive overrepresentation in crisis and also in secure services. So, you end up kind of being picked up by the police and going to sometimes prison before people recognize your mental health problem. And underrepresentation in treatment. Okay. But it's not all bad news for people who are from minoritized ethnic groups. And we do need to make sure that we bear in mind that there are differences depending on your ethnicity in terms of what happens with your mental health and the outcomes. Without a doubt, there are issues around access, there are issues around people's experience when they enter mental health services, and there are certainly differences in outcomes. And what this slide shows is the difference in outcome for people from the white British majority backgrounds, who unfortunately are much more likely to die by suicide than people from minoritized ethnic groups. And people have questioned why that might be. Is there something that's protective about people's faith or religion or their families? We're not quite sure yet, but there's a recent study, which is the study that's cited on this slide, by Paul Moran's group, essentially showing very, very clearly that if you're from a white British background, you are more likely to die by suicide, especially if you're male. Men are more likely to take their lives than women. Although the worrying thing is, in the last few years, we've seen an increase in the rate of suicide in young women. And that's accounted for, oddly enough, by nurses, actually. So 80% of nurses are female. And certainly since COVID, there's been an increase in the rate of nurses taking their lives. So one in every 3 weeks, a doctor in the UK takes their lives. Every 5 to 7 days, a nurse in the UK takes their lives, which isn't great. Which probably makes us think that we need to be better employers in the NHS, actually. There's something about work stuff going on there. The exception is females from any mixed heritage background, okay? And males who are Gypsy Roma traveller, who are more likely to die by suicide than other groups. Just something to bear in mind. The map is actually a map of the world. I'm sure you recognise it. Okay? And this map of the world shows suicide rates across the world. And it's just really just for context, but in the UK, suicide rates are about 7.9 per 100,000 people, which is kind of low average, actually. So we're not doing too badly in terms of the rest of the world, but it's still not good enough. You compare that to places like Russia. So the darker orange denotes the places where there are higher rates of suicide. And you can see that places like Russia, I don't know if that's going to work, places like Russia, places like the USA, and surprisingly, I think, the countries in the southeast of Africa have higher rates of suicide. And the highest rates of suicide in the world are actually in a country called Lesotho, which is in southern Africa, where the rates of suicide are 72 per 100,000 people, 10 times more than we have in the UK. Okay. Anyway, so there's a very eminent psychiatrist from Birmingham called Professor Femi Oyebode. And he described the scope of psychiatry, mental health care, what do we do? And he said, and it's important because you need to know what the scope of psychiatry is. And the scope of psychiatry includes we look after people who have there are about 5 things. Emotional disturbances that are meaningful reactions to environmental or psychosocial distress and stress. Sometimes we look after people who have profound psychological change that's unheralded, not expected by any significant or meaningful stress. It happens anyway. We also look at people who have disturbances of their personality that have a pervasive influence on themselves, their behaviour, and on other people, such that people suffer as a result. There are psychological changes that are directly related to some kind of negative life event, and then, of course, there are psychological changes that are a consequence of substance use, drugs and alcohol. Okay? And that's what we do. The reason I'm telling you that is just because when you start to realize, okay, this is what engenders, these are the kind of problems that people have, it helps you to understand what might be the risk factors for mental illness. So, of course, there's genetics, all right? And genetics is the one that everyone kind of knows about, your inherent propensity, your familial propensity to a particular type of illness. And genetics are important. So this is a graph of schizophrenia. It's small, it doesn't matter, it's small. At the top is basically the general population risk for schizophrenia, and essentially it's 1%. 1 in 100 people will develop schizophrenia. But compare that, if you have an identical twin who has schizophrenia, your chance of developing schizophrenia is 48%. So it's 1 in 2 chance of developing schizophrenia, yeah? So it's almost 50 times what the general population risk is. If you have a parent who has schizophrenia, then your risk of developing schizophrenia is about 6%, 6 times what the general population risk is. So genetics are important, but they're not everything, yeah? Other things that are important, it's a baby, for those I'm sure you recognise, these are perinatal factors, okay? So that means what happens to you when you're in the womb, and what happens to you as you're growing in the womb, and then what happens to you when you're born, and in the first kind of year of life, how you're treated. Now, interestingly, if you are born prematurely, if you are born small for dates, if you are malnourished in the womb, if you are, unfortunately, when you are born, if you experience hypoxia, that means you have low oxygen at birth, you have birth trauma. If your mum develops flu whilst she's carrying you, and you are exposed to that virus, or if you're exposed to a toxin in the womb, that increases the likelihood of you developing a very severe mental illness like schizophrenia in about 20 years' time, which is very interesting. And a really fascinating find, I always find it fascinating anyway, is that after every flu epidemic, there is a spike in the rates of schizophrenia about 20 years later. And the other fascinating finding is that people who are born in the winter months, or kind of spring to winter months, the flu season months, are more likely to develop schizophrenia than people who are born at other times of the year. Everyone's kind of trying to work out now when they're born. Anyway, and that's thought to be because that's when flu viruses are more prevalent. So I'm very interested to know what's going to happen in 20 years' time, 2040, after the COVID epidemic, actually, or the pandemic. Anyway, perinatal factors are really important. Interestingly, inflammation is important to develop as a risk factor for mental health problems, and it's been found that actually anti-inflammatory agents might sometimes help with actually reducing some of the worst outcomes in mental health problems, particularly severe mental health problems. And of course, then there are negative life events at any time of life, but things like bereavement, moving house. Moving house is really stressful, and it can actually trigger and precipitate mental illness, amazingly. It's meant to be a good time, but it's not always. Substance use. In particular, drugs, stimulants, amphetamines, cocaine, and cannabis. Now, there's a few young people in the audience, and there are a few old people in the audience who've probably taken more cannabis than you, I hope. But what we know, and this is really important, if you are in your early to mid-teens and you start smoking cannabis on a regular basis, and that means the evidence is once a week, cannabis that's high-strength cannabis, that's high tetrahydrocannabinol strength, so it's 10% or more, that's what the research studies have looked at, then your risk of developing a psychotic illness by the time you are 25 is 5 to 11 times that it would be if you did not smoke cannabis in your early to mid-teens. And that's important because right now, the kind of cannabis that you will find available on the streets, for those of you who are interested, is much higher than 10% THC content. And it's the THC to CBD, it's this cannabidiol ratio, THC to CBD ratio. And the kind of stuff that you'll get on the streets, skunk has ratio, and the THC content is well over, 25, 30%. And in places like Canada and parts of America where there's a kind of naturalistic experiment happening because they've legalized cannabis, the rates, the strength of cannabis that you can get over the counter, you can go to a shop and buy it, we are talking 50%, 60%, 70%. So we're very interested as psychiatrists to see what's going to happen in Canada. And I have colleagues who have gone over to Canada because they have much better work-life balance, anyway. And they're telling us about the change in demographic of the people who they're now seeing. And they're seeing younger people who have been smoking cannabis in their early age, from early teens. And it's not surprising because I'm sure you know now that we know the brain doesn't stop growing till you're in your early to mid-20s. Early 20s if you're a girl, mid-20s certainly if you're a boy. And so I always say, well, I suppose you're kind of growing your brain in cannabis soup, essentially. What do you expect? Because if I were to, and there have been experiments doing this, giving people tetrahydrocannabinol, injecting it, and it actually does make you paranoid and it can induce hallucinations. Anyway, other thing that's interesting, especially those of you who live in the urban conurbation of London, air pollutants are bad for our mental health. So lead and various things like nitrogen dioxide, they're really bad for us. They can actually increase the likelihood of us developing mental health problems. And living in a very densely urban environment increases your risk of a mental health problem. And then, of course, there's this, trauma. Trauma at any point in your life, whether you're young or old, significantly increases the risk of mental health problems. But particularly trauma as a child. Adverse childhood experiences, and what we mean by that is whether you are physically, sexually, or emotionally abused or neglected, that increases your risk of developing a mental health problem. But not just mental health problems. If you have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, then you are actually at higher risk of having a heart attack when you become an adult. You're at higher risk of developing cancer. You're at higher risk of starting to smoke early. You're at higher risk of having a teenage pregnancy. You're at higher risk of having a shorter life. And that life will be much more likely to be full of ill health. And you're certainly much more likely to have mental health problems. And then there's this. Now, the graph shows poverty rates across by mental health, any kind of mental health problem. And essentially what it's showing is this. If you are rich, look, if you're rich, it doesn't mean that you're not going to ever develop a mental health problem. You can see that the top 20% of the population in terms of wealth are still, the 6.8% have any kind of mental health problem. But being rich definitely helps. Because if you are poorer, if you're on the poorest 20% of our society, you are 2.5 times more likely to have any kind of mental health problem compared with someone who is richer. And when it comes to children who are in the poorest 20% are 4 times more likely to develop a mental health problem than the richest 20% of children. So this graph here, or this slide, is actually looking at household wealth. And on your left-hand side, is a graph of total household wealth by ethnicity. Now, I want you to look at the darker blue bars. Okay, these are the median. And essentially, at the top of the graph are the poorest people, and at the bottom are the richest people. Now, on average, the people at the top are more likely to be, you might not be able to see that, but Black, African, Bangladeshi, Chinese. The people at the bottom are the richest people. Now, this doesn't mean it's kind of 300,000. It doesn't mean how much money you've got in the bank, if only. It means your total kind of assets, including your house. Now, what's interesting is that at the bottom, these are white. If the head of your household is a white British person, then you will be some of the richest people in our society. But that is matched, if you can see the next bar just above, which essentially is very similar household wealth, that's matched by people who are South Asian background of Indian origin. So actually, South Asian people who are of Indian origin are essentially just as well off as people who are white British, which is very different from people who are South Asian of Bangladeshi origin or Pakistani origin. And that's something to do with the historical immigration into the country. So in the 1980s, 1 in 20 Indian men in the UK was a doctor. And actually had, basically had either come over or was the son or daughter of a doctor, or son of a doctor, and they were doing pretty well, actually, because if you immigrate into the country and you come to a job straight away, and then you work for the NHS, everyone gets paid the same amount of money, doesn't matter where you live. You might not get the best, top teaching job in the top teaching hospital, but you still will earn pretty well, even if you live in a much cheaper part of the country. So actually, you're fine. That's different to the immigration of people, particularly, say, from Bangladesh, who at the same time were escaping war, famine, and flood. And actually were coming with far less money, and sometimes seeking sanctuary. And actually, interestingly, the reason that's important is because when you look at the health outcomes of the different South Asian people, you will find that Indian people have much better health outcomes than Bangladeshi people. Bangladeshi people have some of the very worst health outcomes, physical health in particular, some of the worst physical health outcomes of all people in the country. And that's why it's important not to lump everybody together. So there tends to be a kind of, are you black? Are you South Asian? Are you white? And actually, there are different groups of people within that. So the health of the South Asian people who are Indian will mask the not-so-good health of the South Asian people who are Bangladeshi. And that's why it's so important to, as we say, disaggregate the data so that you can work out who's got the problems and support them more. On the right-hand side, essentially, is just the same kind of thing, just showing who lives in the most deprived parts of the country. And again, it matches that. So the Indian people, the white British people, are much less likely to live in deprived areas. Pakistani people, Bangladeshi people are much more likely to live in deprived areas. Why is that important? Because if you happen to be living in a deprived area, you will spend 1/3 of your life with poor health. If you live in an affluent area, you'll spend 1/6 of your life, only 1/6, half of that time, in poor health. And that's really important because not only is that it's not great for you, it's not, for me as a doctor, that's not good clinically, but ethically and morally, it doesn't feel right. And if you don't care about any of that, financially, it's really, really costly. Question is this, because there's something about poverty. What is it about poverty that's problematic to health? Well, we know that, basically, look, if you are lucky enough to have been born into a nice middle-class family, mum and dad, moved from their two-bedroom flat in the city to an affluent suburb where there's a nice school and you've got nice neighbours. So if you're out at, midnight on a Friday night and you're 10 years old, Mrs. Jones will grab you by the ear and take you home and say, I'm sure little Tommy shouldn't be out at this time. You've got enough money so there's good food on the table, it's nutritious. Because you went to a good school, you're able to go to a good university, you get yourself a good job, you're able to live in a nice community, you know how to access healthcare, even though it's hard to get a GP appointment, you know how to do it because you're educated. Then do you know what? Unless you've got some unusual congenital condition or you have a horrendous accident, you'll actually live till quite a ripe age. You'll be fine, and you'll be pretty well for most of it. However, if that isn't the case, if unfortunately your parents aren't so well off, they're not able to live in a nice area, they struggle to put food on the table because they've not got great jobs, they're not able to work, they're at the top of a tower block and the lifts don't work, they live next to a drug dealer, then when, unfortunately, and they're having fights because they're stressed about finances, Then, unfortunately, they split up. You're pretty sad. This is like I'm talking about all the people that I see, actually. I meet them when they're 19 and 20, and I think, if only I'd met you when you were 3, maybe we could have made a difference to this. And actually, too many of them, when they were 11, coming back from school, they're walking, probably looking a little bit sad. Local drug dealer says, I've seen you don't look too happy. You're all right. Tell you what, have a bit of this, it will help you feel a bit better. 2 weeks later, after every day I've been given a little bit of this that helps them feel a bit better, a bit of cannabis, drug dealer says, that stuff I was giving you, it's not free, Actually, I've done you a favour, why don't you do me a favour? And before you know it, it's actually getting quite difficult for this person. And mum is working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet. And actually, the person who's giving this young man, now the young man, 12, 13, a bit of attention, is a local drug dealer, who seems to be the only person who really cares. Anyway, what it means is that if you are in the lower social echelons of our society, okay, then you will be differentially exposed and differentially vulnerable to factors that will negatively impact your health. And that's about our communities, our neighbourhoods, our family. There are individual factors, yes, which can be negative to your health, but also protective to your health. But the fact is that, unfortunately, our social situation really impacts our health outcomes. So this slide shows a map of England. And what I want you to do is have a look at it. You can see that on the again, your left-hand side, that is the darker blue areas are where there's more deprivation, the lighter areas where there's less deprivation. And you should be able to see very clearly that there's a north-south divide. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So that north-south divide, that's what we mean, the north-south divide, other than Cornwall and Thanet, which are also pretty poor and deprived. The graph on the right, you could be, again, the dark areas are where the problems are. You might say, well, hold on a minute, why is she showing us the same the same map again? It looks like the same thing. That's actually a map of depression and anxiety prevalence across the country. And you can see that where the deprivation is, that's where you've got literally twice the rates of depression and anxiety than you have in the more affluent areas. And the northwest is the place where it has the greatest number of people who are living in deprived areas, and it also happens to be the places. So the top of this graph, Knowsley, Liverpool, Hatton, Sefton, this is all parts of northwest Blackpool. They're bleak. And that's where the illness is. And in London, same thing happens. It's not quite such a good representation, but the dark blue areas are where the poverty is, and lo and behold, it's actually the east of London where the issues are, and parts of South London too. Okay, and this is a map showing, going forward, what the mental health issues are going to look like. So the red areas where there's more mental illness, and the lighter green areas are where there's less mental illness. And London's like in pie slices. So you've got the northeast, except for that little bit in the middle where it's kind of white. That's the city of London. That's where the Barbican is. And when it's not to say that people there don't have mental health problems, but their anxiety is about whether or not their flat's gone up in value or not. Whereas next door in Tower Hamlets and Hackney, people are worrying about whether they can put food on the table. Okay. And what about ethnicity? So, as I said before, that people talk about genetics. And they've said, maybe the severe mental illness, particularly things like psychosis, schizophrenia, it's a genetic problem. And maybe it's just an inherent predisposition that black people have to, developing schizophrenia, etc. So I thought I'd just put these 2 papers up. So one of them is a paper that shows incidence rates. That's how often you find new rates of psychosis in a group. And it looked at different ethnic groups in South London, and they followed them up for a number of years. So what was found at the beginning, at kind of late 90s, was that actually the rates of psychosis in the black people were 6 to 7 times more than the rates of psychosis in the white people. They followed them up for a further 10 years or so, and they found that, look, the rates of psychosis in the black people at this point were now about 3 times what they were, 3 times that of the white people. Now, if there's a genetic problem, then you would expect that the rates would stay the same, yeah? But interestingly, the rates have changed. And in fact, the rates in the white people had increased, and the rates in the black people had decreased over such a short time. And that kind of implies that there's something else driving this. A more recent study, this is an Intrepid study, and that's what they were doing was looking at cannabis use and risk of psychosis across 3 different countries in Nigeria, India, and Trinidad. And the reason they chose those countries was because in Nigeria is a majority black country, obviously India majority brown country with Indian people, South Asian people, and Trinidad has people of Indian origin and people of African origin, and they've been living there for years and years. And in Trinidad, the black people were there because of slavery, the brown people were there because of indentured labour, so essentially almost near slavery, but they were paid a bit, but not very much. Okay, and as far as essentially what they found, and this is the thing that's very interesting to me, they found that the rates of psychosis and schizophrenia in Nigeria, Ibadan, and in India were actually very similar to the rates of psychosis everywhere else in the world, including in the white majority countries, in the general populations there, which kind of goes against the idea that this is a genetic thing. But the rates in Trinidad, where there is more cannabis use and there's a lot more trauma, were way higher than they were in the Indian and the Nigerian populations. So the author said, hold on. This indicates that there's something about what happens to you in your social situation. There's something about the historical trauma, perhaps, that these people have undergone that increases the risk of them developing a psychotic illness over and above the usual genetic thing. Remember, across the world, the risk of developing a psychotic illness like schizophrenia is 1%, and that's still true today. So what is it that's happening in the black and the brown people in places like the UK, white majority countries, that increases their risk? Because it looks like it's not simply genetic. If it was genetic, then you would expect that the rates in Nigeria and in India would be would be much, much higher. Anyway, bear this in mind. Not everybody who is socially disadvantaged or discriminated against is going to develop a mental illness. Ethnic minority groups in the UK are probably disproportionately affected by socioeconomic deprivation, and that is a key determinant of health status. Probably is driven by a wider social context in which structural factors are important. But not everybody gets ill. So what does that mean? Does that mean, why is that? Is there anything that we can, is there any, what do we know about the people who are more vulnerable in the groups that are more vulnerable? Is there anything that we can think of that might help protect people from developing illness? And what might be the mechanisms? So this is Jay Shah and Kwame Mackenzie actually wrote this paper, which is saying that essentially they're saying there are 4 dimensions at play here. That as individuals, some people, we all are vulnerable to certain things, but we're also resilient to other things. There are environmental level factors, things about our environment, how our families treat us, maybe stuff to do with what's in the air, stuff to do with how, whether we're bullied, things like that. Then there are interactions between our individual states, our individual risks, and the environmental risks. And then there's timing. Particularly, there are certain times of our lives that we are much more sensitive to developing health problems, particularly mental health problems. So adolescent years are very, very, very crucial, for example. So you might be fine, but if your parents split up, you start smoking cannabis, and basically you get bullied at school, and you're 15, then actually that's a much more sensitive time than if that happened, say, when you are 40. When hopefully by the time you're 40, you will have had sufficient resilience and sufficient ego strength to be able to deal with people bullying you at work. Okay? What about discrimination? Because people say, well, come on, it's got to be about discrimination. Does it affect mental health? Well, when we talk about discrimination, the nature of discrimination, I think we need to bear in mind that there's not just one type of discrimination. There's individual, personally mediated discrimination. There's institutional or structural discrimination. And then there's internalized discrimination. And the personally mediated discrimination, everyone recognises this. This is when people call you names and say nasty things about you and kick you in the face because they don't like the way you look. This is when people beat you up because you're a woman, or they beat you up because you're black, or whatever. And, I'm sure those of you who like football, you'll remember this was the Euros when Saka missed the penalty. In fact, a number of people missed penalties, black and white, but it was only the black players that got monkey chants and bananas thrown at them. That was obvious racism, and it was denounced. The problem is that that does evoke a negative emotional response, and it's been now shown that repeatedly being exposed to overt racism takes its toll. It makes people feel bad, and it affects them physiologically. But it doesn't affect everyone. Then we've got institutional or structural discrimination. Now, this is the one that's probably most important because it's actually quite hidden. And what it means is when there's a difference in access to goods or services or opportunities because of a person's race or sex or gender or their religion or disability, etc. And it kind of manifests as an inherited disadvantage. It's kind of codified into our customs, our practice, and our laws. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so imagine that this is 200 years ago, 150, 200 years ago, and the Dr. Smith giving the Gresham College lecture, that Dr. Smith would be a man, yes? Yes? There's absolutely no way that it would be a woman. And there's 300 years ago then, there's no way that Dr. Smith giving the lecture would be a woman. And actually, we know that. And people saying, yeah, obviously it wouldn't be a woman. And we know why, don't we? Because it was well known that if you educated a woman to any higher degree, then her brains would boil and her ovaries would shrink. That was a scientific fact. And it was written in, eminent medical journals. So Henry Maudsley, who was the not-so-eminent psychiatrist who gave bequeathed some money so that the Maudsley Hospital, which is where I work, could be built, was absolutely convinced and sure, and wrote about the scientific evidence that women could not and should not be educated, because if they were, it wouldn't only be bad for the individual woman, it would be bad for society, because, of course, if you've got all these women whose brains are boiled and can't function, their cognitive decline, they have to be looked after, and also it would result in the end of society as we knew it, because they couldn't reproduce. Okay? And that became just well known. So you can imagine, you're there with there's Jemima and Jonathan having their first baby, and they're very pleased, in Victorian times. And Jemima goes to the Victorian equivalent of the antenatal classes, or the postnatal classes. They're called NCT classes, National Childbirth Trust classes. And she's very proud of her first baby. And she's talking with, Angelica, who's had 4 babies. And she says, let's look at the Jemima, I'm so proud of her. I hope she'll be a doctor like her daddy when she grows up. And, of course, Angelica steps back in horror. Haven't you heard, Jemima? If you educate your little one, her brains will boil and her ovaries will fry. You cannot do this. So when the little one is 8 years old, Daddy comes home from work and she says, Daddy, I want to be a doctor like you. Very sensible, caring, protective father says, no, darling, stick to needlepoint. No education for you, because it will be bad for you and bad for society. And so it goes. And after a while, it became just true. It was just true. You wouldn't dare. And after a while, people don't remember what the reason is. It's just codified into our customs. It's just how it is. So when Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, one of the first female doctor, wrote to the medical school and said, I want to be a doctor, I think I'm clever enough, some of them just fell off their chairs, some of them laughed and said, this woman is an affront to nature. Does she not know what it will mean? Anyway, the problem is that it meant that lots and lots and lots of women didn't get the healthcare they needed, because the healthcare was delivered by men, essentially for men. And even now, women's healthcare it lags behind that of men's, because it's inaction in the face of need. There's no active perpetrator. People aren't doing it on purpose. It just happens to be that there's an inherent understanding that some people are different to others and maybe better than others. Okay. Policies can bring about and cement in discrimination, unfortunately. And we see this, for example, with the one-baby policy in China. In China, unfortunately, there were just too many people. Chinese government said very sensibly, right, you can only have one kid. What they didn't really count on is people saying, well, if we're going to have one kid, it's got to be a male kid, because that male is going to be able to help me in the fields. They're going to bring money into the house. They'll bring another person into the house because they'll get married to a woman. They'll have kids. That'll grow our family. It'll be easier for us. Unfortunately, what it's meant is that lots of women weren't born. So you expect to see a half and half, sex ratio. And unfortunately, in mainland China, there are 50 million women missing. Similar thing in India. Okay. So sometimes you get inadvertent results of your policies that cement in discrimination. And then there's this. This is the doll experiment. So some of you will have heard of it. And this is about internalized discrimination, in this case, internalized racism. So in the 1940s, 50s, America, Kenneth and Mamie Clark were psychologists, and what they were doing was they were saying, look, all the negativity about black people in our society affects how black people think about themselves, and we're going to experiment on this. And what they did was to take two groups of kids, white group, black group, and they gave them a doll, and they gave each of them a white doll and a black doll, and they said to them, okay, which doll is the good doll, the doll that's the friendly doll, the doll that the teacher likes best, the clever doll, the doll that you want to be friends with? Which doll's the bad doll, the naughty doll, the doll that's going to get in trouble, the doll that the teacher's going to tell off, the doll that you don't want to be friends with? So they gave these kids a choice. This is these are kind of primary school kids, about 6, 7 years of age. So they gave the white doll and the black doll. They said, which doll do you want to pick? White doll to the white kids and the black doll to the white kids. They said, which doll is the good doll, the doll you want to be friends with? And the white kids, of course, all picked the white doll. They gave the dolls to the black kids, and they said, which doll's a good doll, the doll you want to be friends with, the doll that the teacher's going to be happy with? And all the black kids picked the white doll, too. And Kenneth and Mamie Clark said, this is what happens. What happens is that people internalize that which they are told. If you are told that you are rubbish and that you are crap, then you will imbibe that somehow, and it will affect your view of your intrinsic self-worth. And if you are told you are inherently inferior, then it will affect your self-esteem and your self-worth, and it will limit what you think you can do. It will limit your dreams, your aspirations. It will limit your self-expression and your autonomy. And eventually you decide, well, what's the point? I shouldn't bother. Might drop out of school. You might think, the darker my skin, the worse I am, so I'm going to lighten it with skin creams. That happens a lot in the Caribbean and in India. You'll notice if you look at Bollywood films, the fairer-skinned actors are the ones who've got the main starry parts, and the baddies have darker skin. Things like that. Anyway, I won't go into this, but this is one to look up. Jane Elliott and her blue eyes, brown eyes exercise. She's a teacher, primary schools again. She basically said to the kids, right, all the kids with brown eyes are in charge, and the kids with blue eyes, you do what the brown-eyed kids said. Within a couple of days, the work of the blue-eyed kids had fallen off. They'd all got rather withdrawn and sitting in the corner at playtime. They weren't playing. The parents said, can you stop this, please? It's really affecting my child's self-esteem. So there's something about internalizing the negative views of society. Anyway, the same thing happens when people are a sexualized minority. And Ilan Meyer talked about the minority stress theory. He said that internalized homophobia that's a negative societal attitude towards people, affects the self. The stigma affects the self. And actual experiences of discrimination and violence affects the self. Arlene Geronimus talked about the repeated racial trauma that people experience and how it can affect people's health, physical and mental health. Robert Carter talked again about racial trauma and said it causes anxiety. It's almost like post-traumatic stress disorder. And so David Williams basically said, look, the multiple aspects of racism can relate to each other and combine additively and interactively with other psychosocial risks, like social disadvantage, and actually affect health. It's all very well, their theories. Is there any evidence that social disadvantage and or discrimination increase the risk of mental disorder? And the answer is yes, there's lots of studies, actually. And this is just a slide showing a number of the studies and things like this. So we know that sexist discrimination accounts for the well-known gender differences in psychiatric symptoms. That's what this Klonoff et al. Said this about 20-odd years ago. Not such a great study, it's still a bit of a theory. But later, when people looked at it a bit more carefully, lo and behold, gender discrimination increases the risk of suffering from depression. And it increases the risk of suffering from anxiety. And if you do have more depression and you're a woman, then it's more likely to be associated with financial hardship and any there's adverse childhood experiences, that increases your risk as well. But good news is, and this is something to bear in mind about who you're going to get together with later on, good news is that if you have a partner who's going to do the washing up, i.e. a partner who performs female stereotyped household tasks, then that's protective against you developing depression, okay? We know that if you're from an LGBTQ plus background, you are 4 times more likely to be treated for anxiety and depression. You are more likely to, unfortunately, more likely to try and harm yourself or make an attempt at your life. And if you're transgender or gender diverse, then you have more depression, more suicidal ideation, more suicidal ideas, and more attempts. And when it comes to mental illness, if you are from a minoritised ethnic group, then actually it's not simply about an increased risk of psychotic symptoms. There's actually an increased risk of common mental disorder, 2 to 4 times increased risk related to the discrimination that you will have suffered during your life. Okay. And of course, people, this thing, intersectionality, you might be a woman. So, for example, I'm a woman, I'm black, I'm actually from a very working class background. Those things can all interact and increase the risk of me developing certain types of health problems. So the question is this: what can we do about it? Well, I hope you understand from what I've been saying that it's not simply about a person's inherent genetic predisposition. There are factors over and above that genetic predisposition that are influenced by the policies and the systems within which we live, the structures within which we live. And they determine, to some extent, the social determinants of health. And that results in health inequality. Okay? And so we need to do something about those structures. So this is just to show you that as an individual, we live in a world where we interact with our friends and our families and our communities, and that's really important. But those friends, families, and those communities are shaped by the institutions and the systems, and they're shaped by policies, and those policies decide the procedures and the processes. And that includes our laws, which can make all the difference. In healthcare, what are we doing? Well, we've recognised this now, and we're starting to change our systems. We call them equity delivery systems. So it's basic things like the thing I said about at the beginning about being able to access care. We're designing our services with the people who are most likely to use them so that the services better meet the needs of those people. Doesn't mean to say that they'll get something significantly different within the service, but they'll be able to access it better, and hopefully they'll have a better experience of it, and then hopefully they'll have a better outcome, so they won't turn up quite so late. Anyway, just to say, finally, excessive rates of mental disorder are seen in those who are socially disadvantaged and those who are discriminated against, over and above any genetic or biological or environmental risks. That social disadvantage is not random. It's to some extent structurally determined. Plus, all types of discrimination, whether it's about race or gender or sexuality, are associated with an increased risk of mental ill health. So what you can do, of course, is try not to discriminate against people best you can. It's likely structural, so you might not be able to do much about that, but if you're ever a policymaker, think about it, please. And if we address those structural inequalities earlier in life, that will help to mitigate some of the risk factors for mental illness later in life. And, as Professor Sir Michael Marmot says, he's a bit of a hero of mine, health inequalities and the social determinants of health are not a footnote to the determinants of health. They are the main issue. Thank you.